Hello and welcome to the Mr. Brown podcast, where I reflect on my journey as an early career teacher, with a special focus on mental health. I am your host, James Brown. Uh-oh, listener. It's bad news. We've both been arrested on suspicion of committing a heinous crime. We're at the police station, and we're being interrogated separately. We each have a choice to make. We can either grass on the other person, or stay silent. Now, if we both choose to stay silent, we'll each end up with 1 year in prison. If I choose to stay silent and you grass on me, then I'm going to prison for 3 years and you're off the hook. Similarly, if you choose to stay silent and I grass on you, you're going to prison for 3 years and I get off the hook. If we both choose to grass on one another, then we're each going to go to prison for 2 years. So what should we do? Remember, we're being interrogated separately. We can't confer. So I'm going to look at this just from my own perspective. From my perspective, you can do one of two things. You can grass on me, or you can stay silent. If you stay silent, then I should grass on you. Because if you stay silent and I grass on you, I get away scot-free. If you choose to grass on me, however, then I should also grass on you. Because if I stayed silent, I'd be going away for 3 years, whereas if I also grassed on you, then I would only go away for 2 years. So it seems that whether you decide to grass on me or to stay silent, the best thing I can do is to grass on you. However, you are equally as capable of following the same line of reasoning as I've just followed. So I must conclude that you've come to the same conclusion. You're also going to grass on me, because whatever I choose to do, that's going to have the best outcome for you. But if we're both going to do the same thing, if we're both going to grass on each other, then we might as well both stay silent. Because if we both stay silent, instead of facing 2 years in prison each, we'd only have 1 year in prison each. However, I must assume that you've also come to the same conclusion. So if you've decided that if we're both going to do the same thing, then it would be better for us both to stay silent, and you therefore decide to stay silent, then it's in my best interests to grass on you. And so on and so forth. This is known as the prisoner's dilemma. It's a very famous game within the field of game theory. Now, don't let the name game theory make you think that it's something not very serious or that it's just recreational. Rather, game theory is the study of strategic interactions. And that's what I've just been running through in my head. I've been running through different strategies, trying to figure out the best thing that I should do. In this episode, and this idea has been rattling around in my head for a little while now, I thought I would have a look at what game theory, and in particular the prisoner's dilemma, could teach us about classroom management, behaviour management in particular. So, first thing, let's take the prisoner's dilemma and turn it into a more general game. So it's going to be you and me playing again. We each have two options. We can either cooperate or defect. If we both cooperate, we each get 3 points. If you cooperate but I defect, I'll get 5 points, you'll get 0. Similarly, if I cooperate and you defect, you'll get 5 points and I'll get 0. And if we both choose to defect, then we'll only get 1 point each. Now, as we saw a minute ago in the case of the prisoner's dilemma, it would seem to make sense that we both act in a purely self-interested way and both defect. However, if we're both going to do the same thing, then we might as well both cooperate, because then we get 3 points rather than 1. So on and so forth. You get stuck in the same kind of loop. But so far, we've limited ourselves just to one game. What if we were playing multiple games? And we could use the outcomes of previous games to inform our decisions and our strategies moving forward. Well, in the 1980s, some mathematicians decided to put this idea to the test. They decided to have a tournament. There would be 200 rounds of this game that I've just described, and the tournament would be ran through 5 times. So 1,000 rounds, really, if you want to think about it that way. And it was an open tournament. Anyone could enter. And by enter, I mean anyone could submit a strategy. So the idea was to accumulate as many points as possible. So by the end of the 200, or indeed by the end of the 1,000 rounds, you want to be the person or the strategy with the most points. And 14 strategies were submitted by other mathematicians working within the field of game theory. Now, as we just saw a moment ago, on the individual level, if we're playing just one game, it seems to make sense to act in a purely self-interested way and to defect. Because whatever your opponent chooses to do, if you defect, that would optimize your own outcome. So it seems that being nasty is going to be a winning strategy here. And that was the assumption that a lot of these mathematicians who submitted a strategy also held. So they thought that being nasty throughout this tournament would pay off, and that if they submitted a nasty strategy, by the end of the tournament, they would emerge the victor with the most points. But that couldn't have been further from the truth. It turned out that the winning strategy, so by the end of the 200 rounds, and they ran the tournament 5 times just to make sure it was accurate, by the very end, the winning strategy was the strategy that had been called tit for tat. So what is the tit for tat strategy? The tit for tat strategy starts off by cooperating, and it will continue cooperating until its opponent defects. And as soon as its opponent has defected, it simply copies its opponent's previous move. And after the tournament, these mathematicians did a more general analysis of the features of the most successful strategies. And it turned out that the most successful strategies were what they called nice. So tit for tat is indeed an example of a nice strategy. By nice, they mean that it starts off cooperating and it wouldn't be the first to defect. That's what nice means. And the best strategies were also forgiving. So some of the strategies that had been submitted held a grudge. What that meant was that as soon as its opponent had defected, it would also defect, and it would continue defecting until the end of the game. So it's very unforgiving. But the best strategies were forgiving. As we saw with tit for tat, if you defected against tit for tat, in the next round it would defect against you, but then that would be it. The slate would be clean. As soon as you start cooperating again, tit for tat will also start cooperating again. So it doesn't hold a grudge. So those were 2 features of the most successful strategies. They were nice, Okay, so they weren't the first to defect, and they were forgiving. So they learnt all this, they disseminated the findings, and they decided to run a second tournament. The second tournament, however, was different in one very important way compared to the first tournament. The first tournament was 200 rounds. The second tournament, however, was an unknown number of rounds. I believe it would average out to 200 again, but for any particular pairing between two strategies, you wouldn't know how many rounds exactly you were going to get. This time, 62 strategies were submitted. So up from 14, now we've got 62 strategies, so it's going to be a much bigger tournament. Guess who wins? Tit for tat, again. And again, they performed an analysis on the most successful strategies. They had some more data now, and of course the tournament was a little bit different, remember. This time there were an unknown number of rounds. So they performed their analyses, and they found 2 more features of the best performing, most successful strategies. So in addition to being nice and forgiving, the best strategies were also retaliatory. Okay, so that means that they weren't pushovers. They would strike back immediately. But again, remember the second feature from before, they were also forgiving. They wouldn't hold a grudge. So if their opponent defected, in the next round they would also defect, they would retaliate, but then all was forgiven. They'd move on. They'd go back to cooperating. Okay, so they were retaliatory. And the fourth feature of the best performing strategies was that they were clear. It was easy for the opposing strategy to work out what they were doing. In each of the tournaments, there was one strategy submitted that was designed to just be completely random, and that strategy didn't do very well. And there were other strategies that were very complicated, so complicated that for all intents and purposes, they just appeared to be completely random. It was very hard to get your head around what they were doing. But the best strategies, they were clear. It was very easy to figure out what they were doing. Okay, so by this time, they've ran 2 tournaments. And the best strategies, the strategies that come out at the end with the most points, are strategies that are nice, forgiving, retaliatory, and clear. And of course, the tit for tat strategy ticks all of those boxes and had won everything so far. Now, what they decided to do next, I find very interesting, these mathematicians who were studying all these strategies. What they decided to do was to run a simulation where the most successful strategies would grow in number and the least successful strategies would diminish in number. So let's say in one tournament, the tit for tat strategy wins. In the next tournament, or in the next generation, if you will, there would be more than one tit for tat strategy. However, if your strategy happened to do very badly in a tournament, then in the next tournament, the next generation, your strategy might not feature at all. Okay, so the best strategies across these generations are going to grow in number, and the worst strategies are going to diminish in number. And they ran this simulation for 1,000 generations. And who came out on top? You guessed it, tit for tat again. So by the end of the 1,000 generations, you've got this population made up of all these different strategies that have kind of got to the very end. And 14.5% of that population of strategies was the tit for tat strategy. So it did very well. Now, like I said at the start, even though it's called game theory, this isn't trivial stuff. This is the study of strategic interactions. And what this simulation has shown is a way in which cooperation might evolve in a population of individuals who are really only self-interested. But if those self-interested individuals are having all these interactions, which are analogous to the prisoner's dilemma game, and if they don't know how many of those interactions they're going to have, then over time it makes sense for them to cooperate. Okay, but does it really apply to the real world? Does this game that we've been describing really apply to the real world? What about random error or noise? Think about it in terms of miscommunication. So, going back to the original game, where each strategy can choose either to cooperate or defect, and then in the next turn, in the next round, they can use what their opponent did in the previous round to inform their current strategy. So remember, with tit for tat, if tit for tat's opponent defected in the last round, then tit for tat would defect in the current round. It's retaliatory, remember. But what if there was a miscommunication? What if its opponent, in fact, cooperated, but tit for tat misinterpreted that cooperation as a defection? What then? So they ran the tournament, again, with extra noise. So they programmed in some random error where every so often decisions would be misinterpreted. And which strategy was the best? Well, again, it was tit for tat. And more generally, the best strategies, again, were nice, forgiving, retaliatory, and clear, just like before. But in order to get over this noise complication, or this misinterpretation complication, the best strategies were in fact extra forgiving. They gave their opponents the benefit of the doubt. So a strategy that would be extra forgiving, for example, might be tit for two tats. So tit for two tats would only retaliate with a defection once their opponent had defected twice. So that would be an example of an extra forgiving strategy, which did especially well in the tournament where there was this extra noise and things weren't quite as clear as they might be. But that tournament where there was extra noise arguably is a closer approximation of what the real world is, what it's like in real life. Now, one important thing to remember with tit for tat, it's the winning strategy. It always ends up on top in terms of points. But despite the fact that it wins overall, it could never actually ever win any of its individual games. So it could only ever draw. So just given the nature of the tit for tat strategy, the best it could ever hope to do against an individual opponent in an individual game would be to draw. So it can only ever draw or lose. But overall, however, it is the winning strategy. Across those tournaments and throughout those generations, it will accumulate the greatest number of points and come out on top. You might describe it as survival of the friendliest. So that's an overview of some ideas from game theory. And where did I get those ideas? I pinched them basically from a Veritasium video that I watched. So I will link that Veritasium video in the description. If anything I've said is unclear, then perhaps it would be a good idea to go and watch that video as well if you're interested. So just to sum up before I start talking about behaviour management. So what game theory has taught us here is that within this context, the best strategies are nice. Okay, that means that they're not the first to defect. They are retaliatory. So if their opponent does defect, then they will also defect on the next turn. But, and this is the third feature, they are also forgiving. So if their opponent has defected, while they will retaliate on the next turn, that's it. All is forgiven. The slate is wiped clean. They won't hold a grudge. They'll go back to cooperating. And finally, they are clear. Okay, now, how might this apply to the context of behaviour management in the classroom? Well, the first characteristic of a winning strategy was being nice. I've heard before some advice, and I've always thought it was misguided, but now I feel I'm backed up by game theory. This advice was not to smile until Christmas. So as a teacher, don't smile until Christmas. You want students to think you're mean and nasty and strict, because that'll pay off in the long run. Well, according to game theory, that's not the best strategy. It would be better to start off nice, to smile from day one. But, of course, if some students don't respond in kind, and they themselves are nasty or they misbehave, then according to game theory, it is very important to retaliate, to strike back immediately. Don't give an inch. Now, I've spoken about this on the podcast before in an episode called Cylinders and Salami. And in particular, I spoke about salami slicing tactics. So salami slicing tactics are, suppose you've got a salami and I want to steal it, but of course if I stole the whole salami, you would notice. Instead, I just take little slices. And of course you may notice me taking little slices, but you think, oh, they're only little slices, it's fine. But you know, if I take enough little slices, then all of a sudden I've got your whole salami. And it's analogous to the way in which children might often incrementally push back against your boundaries and your expectations. And all of a sudden, despite the fact you told students to work in silence, you've now got a very noisy classroom because you let one little bit of conversation slide because it was very quiet and it sounded like they were talking about the work. But all of a sudden, the classroom is very noisy. So this second characteristic of those winning strategies from before, be retaliatory. Don't let students get away with a single slice of salami. It's important to strike back immediately. But once you have struck back, whatever that may be, a consequence, a bit of a telling off, a DT, a phone call home, whatever it might be, once you've done that, it is crucial, according to the third characteristic of those winning strategies, it is crucial to draw a line under it. Do not hold a grudge. And from my own experience, I can say that there have been times where I've had really challenging behaviour in certain classes, and I'd started to dwell on it, and I would go into the next class negatively. And remember, that first characteristic was to be nice. So there have been occasions where if I've had a bad lesson with a student, perhaps they've been really rude to me, then the following lesson, I haven't started the lesson as nice as I would have normally. And that's not a winning strategy, remember. So it is important to be forgiving. Don't be a pushover. Don't give up a single slice of salami. Strike back immediately, but once you've struck back, draw a line under it and move on. Blank slate. Every lesson is a fresh start. And if you remember, in the third and final tournament, when they accounted for random error or miscommunication, the best strategies were the extra forgiving ones. Strategies like tit for two tats. So this suggests that if there's ever a situation in which you're not sure whether a student has misbehaved or not, and I personally find that those situations arise all too often, it means that you should always err on the side of forgiveness. And finally, the final characteristic of those winning strategies was to be clear. And this, of course, seems to be common knowledge in teaching, that your boundaries and your expectations should be crystal clear. You shouldn't act in a random, unexpected way as a teacher when enforcing your behaviour policies. the policies should be completely clear, and students should know the price for defecting. However, they should also know that if they do get it wrong and they do receive a detention, say, that a line will be drawn under it after that consequence. They need to know that you are nice. They need to know that you aren't a pushover. But they also need to know that you're forgiving. That needs to be clear. Okay, so that seems to be what game theory might teach us about classroom management, but I do have some reservations and some caveats. The most obvious one is, what if students don't want to play the game? So those tournaments that we saw earlier were premised on the idea that these strategies would all play one another with a view to accumulating as many points as they could. But many students might not want to engage. They might not want to play the game that you're trying to play with them. They might not want to learn. What do you do then? Going back to the very beginning, when we were both in jail, being interrogated by the police, it sometimes seems more natural to think of the teacher as the police officer, the interrogator, rather than thinking of the teacher and the student as the two prisoners. So what do you do then? Well, you know what? I hadn't planned to draw so heavily on the cylinders and salami episode, but if I remember correctly, according to the cylinder model of cooperation, if someone's being uncooperative, so say we've got a student who just doesn't want to engage, they do not want to play the game that you are proposing they play. So what I mean there is they don't want to learn. So the game in school is to learn, and they don't want to play the game. According to the cylinder model, if I remember correctly, the correct response to that is to provoke them into competition, to draw them out of their uncooperative position into being competitive. And how might this be achieved? Well, essentially what I'm saying here is that you need to coax the child into playing a game. It might not be quite the game that you want to play. It might not be quite the learning game, but you might be able to coax them into playing a game where instead they're trying to earn rewards. So you can lure them into playing the learning game via rewards. Now, of course, rewards aren't always a great strategy. There are all sorts of negative consequences when it comes to rewards. They can often result in short-term positive changes, but the effects don't usually last very long, especially once the rewards have been removed. So they can be problematic. So what should we do instead? Well, instead of relying on rewards to lure them into playing whatever game you want to play with them, the learning game in particular, what about relationships instead? You want to be the sort of person with whom students want to have a good relationship. Now, I believe that those sorts of relationships are inherently valuable, but they can also be leveraged as a means to learning. And how do you do that? Well, it's much more difficult than just resorting to rewards or to sanctions, but it can be done with patience and effort. And going back to game theory, I think that these 4 features of winning strategies are also the fundamental elements of any good relationship, especially relationships for learning. You have to be nice. You can't start off mean. You have to be firm and not a pushover. If students start pushing your boundaries, you have to push back immediately. But you also need to be forgiving. Each lesson is a fresh start. And finally, students need to know all of this about you. They need to know that you are nice, but not a pushover, and also forgiving. Now, no doubt there's a lot more that goes into a good relationship than just those 4 features there. But those 4 features are surely, I would say, necessary conditions of good relationships. if a relationship's going to be a really good one, then those 4 things surely form the foundation. And I think that's all I have to say today. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Oh, before I go, I should do my usual Patreon plea. So this episode took longer than usual to produce, actually. It's quite a long one, this episode. But usually episodes take around 2 hours to produce, and I aim to produce 2 episodes a month, during term time at least. I'll sometimes have a little break in the holidays, I hope you forgive me. But if you think that work is worth at least the price of a coffee, so £2 to £3, once a month, then please consider signing up on my Patreon and helping me cover the cost of producing the podcast. It doesn't cost a lot, but any contribution would be greatly appreciated. And if you sign up on Patreon, you'll also get exclusive early access to unedited videos of my recording sessions. Now, I don't quite know yet how long this podcast episode will be post-editing, but the video is going to be over 50 minutes. So if that appeals to you at all for any strange reason, then again, that's an additional perk for signing up on Patreon. As always, there will be a link in the show notes. Thank you very much. And that's it from me. I hope you enjoyed the episode. And we will talk again soon. The next time we'll talk will be in the new academic year. So I look forward to updating you on how the start of the year goes. I'm a little bit nervous as usual, but I think I'm less nervous than this time last year, and definitely less nervous than the year before that, so I seem to be heading in the right direction. Anyway, we will talk again soon. Bye for now. If you enjoyed this episode, please spread the word in person and on social media. You can follow me on Twitter at Mr. BrownPod or email mrbrownpod@gmail.com. Please subscribe, rate and review in your directory of choice. Please also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/Mr. BrownPod and helping me cover the cost of producing the podcast. Thank you, and talk again soon.